Hi, I'm Alicia.
And I'm Robin, and you're listening to Bowel Moments,
the podcast sharing real talk about the realities of IBD. Served on the rocks. This week, we were delighted to talk to our friend Lauren Erbach Barnfield. We talked to her about being part of the Piano study, which was a study about women living with inflammatory bowel disease who are taking biologic medications while pregnant. We talked to her about returning to grad school with Crohn's, a family, and a full-time job. We talked to her about talking to her young kids about inflammatory bowel disease, and we talk a whole heck of a lot about health insurance. Cheers.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Bowel Moments. This is Robin.
Hey, guys. This is Alicia, and we are really, really excited today because we are joined by our friend, Lauren Erbach Barnfield. Thank you, Lauren, for joining us. It's always nice to have friends on the show, but we were just telling Lauren that while we are friends with her, we also don't entirely know her story. So we're really looking forward to hearing your full story, Lauren. However, we start out by asking you, what are you drinking?
I'm super boring because the flu is going through my house. So I'm trying not to get sick and staying very hydrated. So I'm drinking water with some strawberry lemonade flavor.
Oh, that sounds good. Excellent. Robin, what about you? And we'll keep our fingers crossed that you don't actually get the flu. That's miserable.
I'm rooting for no flu.
Yeah.
So Matt Kasabian, our guest, the end of November, middle of November, was talking about high noons. And so I went and bought some high noons before we did our live during Crohn's and Colitis Awareness Week. So now I have this 12 pack of high noons in my fridge.
Oh my God.
Because I couldn't buy a small thing. So this is a lot of words to tell you that I'm drinking a black cherry high noon on Matt's recommendation.
Matt, I think, is truly the biggest high noon fan that we've ever met. He should work for them. He has a shirt. I mean, it was a lot.
It was a lot, but it's pretty good though.
I am drinking an orange lemon gin cooler, which is also a lot of words. Now that we know what we're drinking. Lauren, next question for you is, tell us your IBD story. What brought you into our community?
I was just saying, we were talking about that, you don't know that you know my whole story. I've been a part of the community for so long at this point. I've got it down to sound bites. So I'm going to try and tell the long version. So when I was a sophomore in college, I just started having weird stomach pains, a lot, confusing stomach pains, didn't know what they were, knew that it hurt a lot, knew that if I ate a lot, I would get really gassy in class. So I didn't eat a lot of the time. I started Googling, where is your appendix? Pulling over on the side of the road, driving places, trying to just figure out what this strange pain was. And then started seeing blood in my stool. And so I called my parents, who I went to school about 3 hours from home. And my mom said, well, why don't you come home and just go to the doctor? So I went to just my regular primary care doctor. And I think a lot of people have had this experience. They said, oh, it's probably IBS, and put me on a lot of fiber supplements, which was not great for someone with IBD. And so my symptoms got a lot worse very quickly, which was not fun at the time, but in hindsight, helped me get diagnosed more quickly because I took such a nosedive. And so it got to the point where I called my parents at 3:00 in the morning and was like, I am losing so much blood. I don't know what to do. I'm starting to feel faint. I don't know what this is, but something is wrong. And I went to a small school in Iowa, and my dad happened to also be in Iowa at the time on business, a couple hours from my school. And he said, okay, go wake somebody up so you're not alone in your dorm room. Have somebody come be in your room with you. I'll be there as soon as I can. And as my dad started driving to come pick me up, as soon as doctor's offices opened, my mom was on the phone. And I was 20, and my mom had always been amazing. And so I didn't have an appreciation at the time for the superhuman feat she pulled off that day. But in the time it took my dad to get to me and for us to get home, which was probably 5 or 6 hours in total, my mom not only had a referral to a gastroenterologist, she had an appointment for me with the gastroenterologist that afternoon and a colonoscopy scheduled for 2 days later before the gastroenterologist had even seen me.
Super mom.
Wow.
Super mom.
Amazing. and at the time I was like, oh, of course she did. It's mom. And now that I have to schedule my own appointments and my own colonoscopies, I just scheduled my colonoscopy last week and it's in February. So, I know what a big deal that was. And truth be told, she probably would have had the scope scheduled for the next day, but there's the whole fasting and prep part. So, I had to show up and get ready. So I did the thing, went to the gastroenterologist, had the most miserable colonoscopy prep of my life. I don't feel like they're that bad anymore. This one was not good, but I made it and had my colonoscopy and was diagnosed with, at the time, ulcerative colitis. It turned out that was close, but not quite right. Again, I think that's pretty common. So, but even though they were close, but not quite right, I still think now that I know so many other people's stories, I'm so lucky that it was that fast, that it was a doctor's appointment, a colonoscopy, and then, oh, here's like what we think this is. I know people who have spent months and months and months and months and months trying to get that answer. So props to my mom for that one. And then started on some medication and I was okay-ish for a while. I was never stellar, but I was never totally miserable. I was on a medication that was helpful-ish. I wasn't bleeding. I wasn't sprinting to the bathroom or having accidents, but I wasn't feeling awesome. Graduated college and got a high-stress job and was flaring on and off constantly and was still seeing just a family practice gastroenterologist because I didn't know that there were other kinds of gastroenterologists. And so every time I flared a little bit, I would get prednisone and then I would have prednisone for a while until I was back in remission. And then I would go back to this maintenance medication that clearly was not really maintaining me, but was making my life okay-ish. And eventually got sick of doing that yo-yo back and forth and found out that there was this such thing as an IBD specialist GI and transferred my care to the University of Chicago. And my doctor said, I really think that you should try Remicade. I think that would be a better fit for you. But I still didn't know what I know now about IBD. And so that was really scary. I knew that these drugs had black box warnings and didn't really understand. It had been 12 or so years at that point. So all I really remembered was life kind of, not the quality of life that I have now. And so I don't think I realized what I was giving up by not utilizing the best treatments available to me. And so I dug my heels in for a while longer. And then 2 years after I started seeing a specialist, landed myself in the hospital for a steroid resistant flare. I was flaring and I had been on as much prednisone as my doctor was willing to give me outpatient for a couple of weeks with no change at all. And she said, I want you to come in. We're going to do a flex sig, but you should be prepared to be admitted if we're still seeing inflammation. And I thought, that's hilarious. I'm not going to be admitted. I had a big work event that weekend. Did not want to be admitted. So I packed my bag thinking, okay, if I pack this hospital bag, I'm not going to need it. I had never been hospitalized for my Crohn's before. And so I just was quite sure I wouldn't be. And I was. So they still saw inflammation. I landed myself a room with a view at the University of Chicago Medicine and a new treatment plan. I got put on IV steroids and finally bit the bullet and admitted that my doctors were probably right and that I should consider Remicade or Humira were the options that they gave me that they thought were the best for me at that time. This was in 2014. So things like Entyvio were brand new. And I knew myself well enough to know that I would not be a good patient on a drug that I had to administer myself. I have to give myself monthly B12 injections. And sometimes I remember and sometimes I don't. And while that's okay-ish for something like B12, would not be great for something like Humira that requires you to be timely. And I also, despite the fact that I was single, I was in my late 20s and I knew that I wanted to have kids someday. And I liked the idea of being on a drug like Remicade that had been really highly studied during pregnancy, because I thought, okay, if I can get this new treatment and I can get stable, then that's one less thing I have to do. I'm not getting stable on something that's a big question mark or a red flag for pregnancy. And then I have to think about changing all of that before I could have kids someday. So I chose Remicade and it changed my life completely for the better. I can't believe it took me 2 years of kicking and screaming with a doctor I trusted before I admitted defeat. And I've been on Remicade now for 8 years. Well, I'm on a biosimilar now, which was not my choice. That's a whole nother story. But the biosimilar is working. And so I've been in really pretty good remission for 8 years, which I couldn't have imagined before that. And yeah, that's how we landed here, I suppose.
I don't think you're alone in being afraid to take some of these medications that you have to inject or infuse. I really do think a lot of people equate that with chemotherapy. And so it becomes this big thing, becomes a lot scarier than I think it probably is. Like you said, there's these warnings and, they have to tell you all of the potential stuff that could happen. But I'm really impressed with how thoughtful you were about going about your medication choice, of like looking so far down the road to be able to say like, okay, I'm going to try to align this so that I don't have to make changes where changes maybe aren't necessary. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised about that with you, but also I'm like, man, that's really thoughtful. That was my first, I'm like, that is very planful of you. So that's great.
One less thing to worry about.
I mean, they got enough, unfortunately. When did your diagnosis change? Because you said you were initially diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. Was it when you went to the University of Chicago that they were like, this is actually something else? And how did they figure that out?
Yeah. So it was when I went to the University of Chicago. I've had 2 different doctors at University of Chicago. The first doctor I saw there had a fellow when I started seeing them. And then they hired his fellow after she finished her fellowship as the first female IBD specialist at the University of Chicago. And then I continued my care with her. She's amazing. But the first doctor I saw there at my first appointment with him, he said, so tell me about your Crohn's disease. And I said, no, I have ulcerative colitis. And he said, yeah, we'll see. And I was like, who is this person? Who does he think he is? And I've known him a long time now. And I know that that's his sense of humor. And he was right. So yeah, I had funnily enough, when I was diagnosed, they were looking for Crohn's disease because my blood work showed I was anemic and I had a B12 deficiency, which is really common in Crohn's disease. So I had some markers that they were looking for Crohn's, but my Crohn's is in my colon. And so easy to confuse, especially when I didn't have an appreciation for, at the time, how much variance there is just in Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. So if you're going to a gastroenterologist that is seeing people for their annual colonoscopies because they're over the age of 50, and so now they're just getting screenings routinely, and people with diverticulitis and Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis and IBS and celiacs and, anything under the sun, how could you possibly be an expert in all of the layers and all of the latest treatments and all of the everything with these really complex conditions? But I had never heard of Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis before we were talking about them as something I might have. And so it wouldn't occur to me. It was news to me at 20 that there was such thing as a gastroenterologist, let alone a gastroenterologist that specializes in like 2 diseases. So yeah, that was the change.
I mean, that is really surprising, especially if you haven't had to deal with chronic illness either in your family or yourself as you're growing up. Yeah, you don't necessarily think that there's special doctors. I don't know. I also lived in the middle of like nowhere. So you were lucky if there was a doctor, I should say. So it's not surprising that you weren't like, I know exactly what these people do. And I know that they specialize in this, so that's not surprising. But I'm glad you found somebody that you connected with when you did finally get to your specialist GI, and that she stuck around so you could keep seeing her. That's really convenient.
She did have the nerve to be on maternity leave when I was inpatient.
How rude.
I know. How dare she? This lovely woman who specializes in IBD and pregnancy had to go have her own pregnancy. Unbelievable.
Unbelievable. I mean, really, the least she could have done is like wheeled herself and her baby into your room and been like, all right, we're here. We're going to consult now with you.
Right?
If you don't mind, can we talk about babies?
Yeah.
Okay, because you mentioned that you specifically you chose a drug that you knew that had some testing related to pregnancy. However, it wasn't until somewhat recently, and we talked to, I think it was Dr. Kane that we talked to, and I think somebody else that we talked to that was part of the piano study, which is a study of women who are taking biologics and get pregnant. And so turns out you are part of that study because you also have 2 beautiful children. So talk about the process of when you started talking to your doctor about wanting to get pregnant. What was that like? And then also, when did they introduce you to the piano study? And then what was it like to be part of that? So there's really 3 questions in there. Start with just like, what was the process of you deciding to get pregnant? How did you have to work with your doctor on that? Did you have to work with your doctor on that?
So only a little is the answer to that. I knew that with a chronic illness, I should at least consider the possibility that there might be things to think about before I got pregnant. And so when my husband and I were talking about wanting to have kids, I think I sent like a my chart message. It wasn't anything real formal, but said, Mark and I are thinking we want to have kids. Here's kind of our timeline. What do I need to do? And because I had listened to her finally and started a treatment that got me stable, she said, you've been in a really good, stable remission for a long time. You can take a prenatal vitamin if you want, but you're so stable at this point. I didn't have to see, I know a lot of Crohn's patients who see doctors that specialize like high risk OBs. I didn't have to see a high risk OB. I just saw plain old regular OB. There was nothing about my treatment that she would change were I to get pregnant. And so it was really just like, cool, well, let me know if you have good news to share. That would be really exciting. I'm so happy for you. There was no big to do. So it was pretty nice to be in a place where I felt like I wasn't putting my health at risk. I wasn't putting a potential baby's health at risk just by the medications that I needed to take. I knew about the piano study before I even started Remicade because I knew that Remicade had been studied it had been around the longest of the biologics and had been studied in pregnant women. And so being a nerd who is really interested in all of this stuff, I knew that I was going to benefit from this research because I could feel okay about staying on Remicade while I was pregnant because other people had either been brave enough to just stay on Remicade and see what happens or had no choice because you have to stay healthy. Your body is literally growing another human. So if you can't nourish your own body, how can you also grow another human? So, I'm aware that probably a lot of the first women who were studied on it didn't have the choice to be part of a study or not. They just needed the Remicade to stay healthy. But I was lucky enough to make the choice and know that it was a safe choice because other people were willing to do the extra work during their pregnancy and participate in this study. And so I got on Google to look up whether they were still doing this study, whether I could participate in it or be a part of it, and found it online and signed up for it myself because it was really important to me to allow this research to continue because I had benefited so much from it.
What was required of you? Like, did you have to go in and talk to people? Did they do tests on you? Can they scope a pregnant person? Like, what was required of you to be part of this?
So for me, at this point in the study, it had been going on for so long that it was mostly phone calls. they would call and ask questions about my symptoms, how I was feeling. They have access to, I had to sign a lot of my life away. They have access to my medical records. I have 2 kids, so I participated during both of my pregnancies. So they had access to the medical records of both of my children. And they did calls throughout my pregnancy, I want to say every 3 months or so. And then they did some postpartum calls. And then they have done follow-up calls about my kids. So there were like at 3 months old and 6 months old and 9 months old. And then they become less frequent. And I think what they're looking at more now is, okay, we know that we're delivering healthy babies, but then what does that look like a few years down the road? You know, what are we seeing in delivery? What are we seeing in a 2-year-old whose mom took Remicade? And so it's really just been a lot of releasing information and answering some pretty basic questions. So I feel like it is literally the least I could do to give back.
So it really wasn't anything like procedural. They didn't like have to do anything to you, no blood work or anything like that. That's pretty easy.
No, and I know that prior iterations of the study have had blood work, stool samples, things like that. I know people who participated in the study earlier on, but at this point, at least when I participated in it, no, it was pretty easy lift.
Huh. That's so interesting. I guess that makes sense because like you said, you were sort of at the tail end of it, but it's really nice that you were able to give back in that way and help other women feel much more secure in their decisions. So that's great. So Lauren, you mentioned when you were in school and stress sort of exacerbated things, but also, I mean, you do have a lot on your plate, and one of the things is you have gone back to get a master's degree, which is really, really exciting, a different master's degree in public health. So I'm curious if your disease was part of your interest in public health. I know also, your profession is also in sort of more the illness world as well. So I know that has a public health bent to it as well. But talk to us a little bit about going to school, kind of how you've incorporated that into your life, because you still have a full-time job and a family. And then also, has your disease impacted your choice in the degree program that you were looking at as well?
So it fits in honestly easier than I thought it would to go back to school, partially because most of what I do in my life is in a caring capacity for others. I'm a mom of little ones. I work in the nonprofit health space in patient and community outreach. So a lot of working with patients and healthcare providers and, just talking to other people and caring for people in difficult times. And school has given me something that allows me to use a different part of my brain, a more analytical part of my brain, and learn new things in a way that I haven't done in 15 years. And it's been very interesting. I chose public health, and I am hearing myself out loud say it's so nice to do something that is not caring for others. And the other master's degree I considered was a social work master's. So I suppose I chose the right one. But I chose public health because I've worked in health and nonprofits for about a decade now. And I started really seriously thinking about going to grad school during the pandemic at a time when I was following epidemiologists on social media and learning about epidemiology in a way that I don't think any of us really thought much about epidemiology except epidemiologists until the pandemic. And I was really fascinated by what they were learning and how they were learning it and how you could study a disease in that way. Since being in grad school, I have learned that I like to learn from epidemiologists. That is probably the least favorite course I have taken. It's a lot of number crunching and math in epidemiology, and I would really like to read your number crunching. I don't particularly like to do it myself, but I have been learning so much and having so much fun doing it, which sounds so nerdy and ridiculous. But you don't ever get to learn like that as an adult unless you are in school. You're not held accountable for it. You don't ever have, outside of work, really anybody checking on you. You just we learn things from the internet, or we're scrolling Facebook or TikTok and we're like, yes, I learned this thing. And obviously it's accurate. The end. You never have somebody checking your work and saying like, you did this well, but maybe think about that. And it's a nice thing to revisit and do again.
Yeah, I am right now in the process of doing continuing education for my license, right? Because I'm a licensed social worker. And because I'm not a clinical social worker and I really don't have to be licensed, I end up choosing just classes I think are interesting, to take. And so I have this very long course I'm taking that I literally just did it because I'm interested in it. And so it's been really fun to learn something and also be held accountable for it. You're right. Like there's definitely times where I've chosen books because I'm like, this is going to be so interesting. And then I fall asleep while I'm reading it and never really kind of actually learned anything. But this one, I actually have to do tests and prove that I did learn something from it. So it's kind of fun. Will having this degree change anything about what you're doing in your job? Will it change the type of job you take? Like, would you change jobs because of this new degree? And is there anything about IBD that's like something that you would intend to research as part of your degree program? Again, 3 questions for you.
So at this point, no, I don't see it really changing what I'm doing day to day. I really like my work. It's a helpful degree to have in my line of work. Should I continue down this road or want to progress in my career, I think it will be really helpful. And it's allowed me to learn how to research the things that I'm doing in my day-to-day work a little bit more thoroughly, because I have to read research research articles for school. And so I'm just more comfortable finding them and navigating them and pulling out what I need from them. So if I'm working on an education program and curious about something, sometimes I'll dig out Google Scholar and see what I can find now, which I never thought that I would do. What else did you ask in your triple question?
Is there anything about inflammatory bowel disease that you are intending to incorporate or have incorporated into your program?
I haven't yet, except for some course discussions. I'm in a healthcare administration class right now for part of my degree. And so a lot of the discussion in that class has been around the cost of healthcare and how, is healthcare a right or a privilege? And how do we give access to healthcare, but also pay clinicians? And those very nuanced, high level conversations where I have very strong opinions on what the answers should be, and maybe not all of the answers about how to get there. And I find it really helpful to speak to my own personal experience sometimes in answering those questions, because I think if you have never been faced with a chronic illness or have never been very close to someone who has faced a chronic illness, it can seem like expensive healthcare is a choice, or that healthcare is never really that expensive, right? We all have insurance. And I think if you are not someone who has ever been sick enough to really need your health insurance, where you're hitting your out-of-pocket max regularly, where you're checking a formulary to see if your medication is even covered by your health insurance, it is really easy to assume that the healthcare system works as it is intended, that you get your insurance, and if you're really in a bind, your insurance covers you, and that's what it's there for. And yay. And I think that especially with a lot of my classmates who are younger and, maybe getting a master's degree right after a bachelor's degree that they got right out of high school, that is their experience with the healthcare system. That was mine until I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And if you had told me when I was diagnosed that I would eventually be on a medication that's billed anywhere from $8,000 to $30,000, I never would have believed you. And that I would be taking that medication every 7 weeks, and that's just one thing that I do for my health. That's just one medication. And so I find having that real life experience, having those numbers, being able to say, if we had a lifetime out of pocket maximum that our insurance providers could hold us to, I could hit mine in 7 years, 8 years. And then what would I do? And that this is not through any poor choice that I made. This wasn't lifestyle. This wasn't a poor diet. It is just the luck of the draw, right? Some genetics, some other stuff that we're still learning about all came together. And so I have Crohn's disease. And sometimes you can really watch the wheels turning inside people's minds when you can put it into a real life scenario with someone that they're looking at face to face. It's harder to just then talk in hypotheticals of, well, if people would only care about preventative care, then it wouldn't be this expensive, or, if XYZ. So I find it helpful in that way. I have not looked into it or done any of my papers or anything about it yet. For a long time, I was really entrenched in the IBD community in social media. I was blogging about being a runner with Crohn's disease. I still have some of my very closest friends are Crohn's and colitis patients. And so for a while, it became too much of my life was Crohn's disease and being a Crohn's patient. And so sometimes it's nice to learn about other things. One of my favorite research papers that I have done so far in school was about gun violence as a public health issue, and not something I've personally experienced, something, again, I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about. But I guess the short version of that very long answer is that I've spent the last 17 years as a Crohn's patient learning everything I needed to know about my own Crohn's disease. And so it's nice to learn something new sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and I do think bringing your personal experience to the table is particularly beneficial for people who are younger, because the healthcare system there's nothing simple about it. And it gets more and more complicated every single day because we are able to make it more complicated, because frankly, not we, businesses are able to make it more complicated. It used to be that you get your health insurance covers stuff. It was very much contractual. They do this, I do this, I pay them, they pay that, whatever. And now you add into it all of these other layers of specialty pharmacy, and, it just has become a really complicated place. And then also, the other thing I think that gets really lost in this is that the way that doctors are able to bill is really challenged by our own system. And so you talk about doctors being fairly compensated. Great. I agree. We have to figure out how doctors can stay compensated. But at the same token, the way that insurance companies and the way that our healthcare system is set up for doctors to be compensated is with these specific billing codes. And if they're not doing things, then they can't necessarily bill for it. So a lot of times doctors, and that's driving some doctors away from profession. So think of how often you and your gastroenterologist are really just having conversations and there's nothing being done to you. You're not getting a scope. You're not having a procedure done. Well, they can only bill for a certain amount for that time. And so doctors that deal with people with chronic illnesses are sort of dry. They're becoming less and less because we're setting up a system that's we're going to end up with completely skewed, not enough doctors. They're not able to bill. They're not really able to get compensated probably at the rate they need to. But the insurance companies are going to make lots of money, and their CEOs are going to have yachts that go to their yachts, small yachts that drive to their big yachts. I'm not bitter.
We don't rally against the insurance companies on this podcast at all, ever. We've never done it before. I'm shocked by this information that you're sharing with us, Alicia.
Sorry. I really think that, I don't know, this is maybe a little Pollyanna of me speaking of wide-eyed Pollyannas, but I think that if insurance companies, it's exactly like sitting down with your class. If insurance companies sat down and really talked to patients that have to utilize their care, I would hope that it would change their mind. I would hope that just being able to sit at a table with a lot of people being it's a full-time job to deal with my health,
my gosh,
with my healthcare.
It is a full-time job. It's I saw someone's post on social that said, when you get diagnosed with a chronic illness, it's basically you just got a full-time unpaid administrative job. Legit. I've talked about that sometimes on the show before, just saying I'm exhausted. I don't have the energy to make one more doctor's appointment. I just don't have the energy to follow up with my doctor one more time, or to reach out to my doctor to make sure they file the appeal, because even though I've been on this medication for 5 years and it is working without fail every year, when it's time to renew a prescription, it gets denied and then has to be appealed. And then, and it's the medication is working. I've been on it for 5 years. You have to do blood tests to make sure that it's still in your system, all of these things, but then it still gets denied, still has to be appealed. It's it's exhausting. It is so exhausting. And then think about, I've had 3 scopes this year. So, I've reached my max out of pocket, not just my deductible, but my max out of pocket was probably after scope number 2.
Mm-hmm.
So
when I tell people that I just budget to meet my out-of-pocket max every year and have since 2014.
Yes.
People who have never been sick, just it is hard to fathom that you would do that. And that has impact on your life as a chronic illness patient in more ways than just the bills for that year and the time and the administrative labor of making doctor's appointments and getting things approved and all of that. I changed jobs in 2019 and I got a job offer in August, and I had to think about when was my next infusion? When would I lose insurance from job one? When would I get access? Because I carried insurance for my family. When would I get access to insurance with job two? Or should we, because I'm lucky enough to be married, which is a perk when insurance is tied to your job. It is a perk for other reasons. Mark is a lovely human. But when it comes to healthcare and insurance, that was a perk because I knew that I could switch to his insurance immediately if I needed to, due to that change in life situation, I think, as they call it. But then, okay, I knew I would meet an out-of-pocket max again before the end of the year after starting a new job in September. So now we've hit it once in 2019. We'll hit whatever the out-of-pocket max is on the other insurance in the end of 2019, and then have another out-of-pocket max to hit in the early part of 2020. So not only are you thinking about, is this the right move for my career? You're thinking about, can I afford this in the short term? Even if it's a better decision financially, a better decision for my career, I think it's going to make me happier, whatever, all signs point to yes. It also came down to thinking about, can we afford this just in the short term because of the cost of being on a medication that allows me to do crazy things like hold down a job and raise my children. And I think that is also, it is just part of my life at this point, and it is just a thing that I do as a Crohn's patient. But when you start saying it out loud, or when you say it out loud to somebody who has not lived that experience and watch their eyes get bigger and bigger, you start to realize how nuts that is.
It's really nuts. And I actually changed jobs this year, and it was earlier in the year. And so I think that I had at least met my deductible at the beginning of the year at my previous job before I changed jobs and had to start all over again. But your kids are really young. But one thing that I do because of this whole thing is have taught Logan and Bailey, who've been on the show, how to pick insurance. Like, they're still on my insurance for only a very short amount of time. They have left to be on my insurance. But whenever the new year started, because the type of plan we picked, like, their prescriptions were more expensive. And they're like, why are our prescriptions so expensive in January, Mom? Like, the pharmacist doesn't think that it should be this much and all that. And I'm like, babe, I have to explain to them what kind of insurance we have. Why did we choose that insurance? How that insurance is actually a lot less expensive in the long run because of how much my medicine is and how much my treatments are and how I have to plan to have at least one scope per year, no matter what. And so teaching them this, it has forced that conversation, which I'm kind of grateful for in a weird way, because they now know how to do that when they're job hunting themselves or when they're reviewing, their options for insurance at their jobs. They know how to look at it and say, this is the premium that I pay, and this saves me money if I never go to the doctor once. But if I have to go to the doctor, then this type of insurance and premium is actually less expensive over the course of the whole year. And I think that lots of people have the luxury of never understanding that.
God, that sounds nice.
Doesn't it? But for people with chronic illness, you have to know the ins and outs, and you have to look at overall cost of what your insurance is. And you might think that you have a $10 copay and that's saving you money, but it's actually not saving you money, depending on how often you go to the doctor and how many times you have to pay that $10 copay and how much your premium is every month that they're automatically deducting out of your paycheck that you don't even realize, right? So
you don't pay attention to.
You don't pay attention to it.
It's funny you should mention that affecting how you talk to your kids about insurance or doctors or things like that. My kids, you're right. My kids are little, But even so, I took my son to the doctor yesterday. So we have influenza going through our house. Teddy has the flu. And we were driving to the doctor and he's sitting in the back in his little car seat. And he said, Mama, will you tell the doctor about my ouchies? And I said, well, who knows Teddy's body better, Mama or Teddy? He's like, Teddy does. And I said, so I'll help you, but you need to tell the doctor how you feel and what's ouchy because you know better than Mama. I'm not inside your body. And he did. I love their pediatrician because he asks them, but the doctor asked and he was, pointing to where on his head it hurt and his throat hurt and his ears hurt. And I didn't have to say a thing. And that's something that some adults can't do. So
Yes.
you can start that when you're little in age appropriate ways. What a gift that is,
Yes.
should they ever
Agreed.
have to need it.
Agreed.
I mean, they'll need it for me when I'm, fatty and old. So maybe it's self-serving. I don't know.
No, it's good for them too. I mean, everybody's going to need to go to the doctor at some point, even if it's just like you said, you have the flu and you have to get something, Tamiflu or something. But speaking of your kids, because your disease is so well controlled, is this something you've had to talk to them about?
I do talk to them about it a little bit. Like I said, some of my closest friends are IBD patients. So there are 3 women in my life. 2 of us have Crohn's and 2 have ulcerative colitis. And my kids, they're like honorary aunties to my kids, and 2 have ostomies. And so my kids both have an Ollie teddy bear that has a little ostomy. And so we've talked about what that is in age appropriate ways. My kids are maybe some of the only 4 and 5-year-olds who don't get in trouble for talking about poop and making jokes about butts and poop because it is like normal conversation in my house. And they know I go to the doctor every 7 weeks and get a special medication. And they were home with us for 18 months during the pandemic. And so they'd see me leave to go get my medicine. And they don't understand in detail, but my kids were raised by like PBS Kids for a year and a half during the pandemic and got really into some kids shows about science. So they were very into, your white blood cells that fight the germs. And so we've talked about how sometimes mommy's body thinks that things shouldn't be there that really should be there. And so it tries to get rid of them, but it's really mommy's body that she needs. And so that I go to the doctor and I get this special medicine, and that makes it so my body doesn't do that and I can play with them and do fun things. And that if I don't take that medicine, then I could get really sick. And as they say, I could have to have a sleepover at the doctor, and that I like to stay at home. I don't want to have a sleepover at the doctor. And they ask lots of questions. One of our close friends is a physician's assistant in colorectal surgery. And so they know that Aunt Rachel is a poop doctor. And we had when my daughter was little, so we had a little training toilet in the bathroom when Alice was potty training, and one of her Ken dolls was like naked on this little kid potty for days at a time. And it became this running joke in our house of what's wrong with Ken? He's still on the potty. And so then she was FaceTiming Aunt Rachel to say, Ken has been sitting on the potty for a long time. Aunt Rachel, Mama said, you're a poop doctor. What's wrong with Ken? And because my friends are lovely and take my children so seriously, then Ken had like a medical exam. How did his belly feel? And was his poop hard or was it soft? So those things are probably weird and not like normal childhood that my kids are exposed to because of my disease. But, they've never seen me really sick. They don't know how serious it can be. To them, I think it's just normal part of mommy's life. And mommy has all these friends that talk about poop, and some of them poop in a bag from their tummy. And it just is normal to them.
which is pretty amazing. And I will say that the weird poop talk, I mean, I feel like Logan and Bailey have turned out just fine. Because while I was not diagnosed before I had them, Logan was 2.5 and Bailey turned 1 while I was in the hospital. So I feel like they have no memory of me without it. I mean, at some point in time, they were my bathroom scouts. When we would go to a new place, like they, Mom, bathroom's over there. Perfect. This is the information that I need to know right now. So they turned out just fine.
You mentioned blogging and having a blog of being like a runner with Crohn's disease. I'm always impressed. I guess I shouldn't say this because like Robin is putting her story out into the world like every single episode that we do this, but like I'm always impressed, but also surprised that people are wanting to put their story out and share their life in such a like public manner. And again, I say this to Robin, who's currently doing that on every single episode. So Robin, I hope you love it because it's happening.
It's happening.
How did you decide to start a blog? And when you were starting it, did you realize that it would become this huge public forum? Like, what was that part of it? Or was it just sort of cathartic way of getting the word out? And you didn't necessarily think about like that this is sort of out into the world forever now?
And before you answer that, I want to tell you that I knew about you from your blog before we actually met and became friends. So
you're famous.
Just, wanted to just say that like
way back when. I mean, I think I was raised by the internet. I've resisted the term millennial, but I am a millennial, and I grew up with MySpace and, joined Facebook when it was just for college kids. And then everybody had a blog at Blogspot or LiveJournal. And it was just kind of a thing that you did. I read a book this past year called Trick Mirror. It was the collection of essays, and a lot of it was about the experience of growing up as a millennial and writing these live journals. And it was just sort of what you did. And then it became a way to find community a little bit. Because like I said, I had never heard the words Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis until I got diagnosed with them. And so like Megan Starshack, who I know has been on your show, I met through Twitter years before I met Megan in person. And it was a way to find other people who had similar experiences to me. And I think like anything, it can be so wonderful and it can also be so terrible. Yeah, like anything on the internet. I think probably because of some of the scary things I had read on the internet was why I resisted a medication that was right for me for 2 years. When I was deciding between Remicade or Humira, my mother is a saint. She was at the hospital with me every single day. And when we started having those conversations about the medication, my rule for her was you may not Google it. You can make a list of questions and I will ask the doctor. You can be here when the doctor is rounding. You can ask any questions you want. I want you to feel comfortable with this. I know you care about me, but you may not Google it because there's so much scary, unchecked misinformation out there. And I think that can be really dangerous for patients who are looking for community and then find community, but also misinformation that is easy to assume is true because you're reading it. And so like we were talking about with school, nobody's fact checking in these little communities that pop up online, but it can also be a really good thing. It was really good for me to know that there were other young people living with these diseases and still having really active social lives. It was good for me to know that there were people who had kids who had IBD. I found out about the piano study because of Googling about medications that might be safe for pregnancy. I just wandered down like an internet rabbit hole, but I don't know. That's a thing I think about a lot because I think that it is both the very best thing for patients with chronic illness and like the very worst all at the same time, kind of all wrapped up together.
It reminds me a little bit of kind of our conversation with J Pouch Jasmine. So Jasmine, who goes by J Pouch Jasmine as her Instagram handle, she talked about like that was the reason she started her Instagram page was because like all you see is either the very worst or the very best. It seems like people in the middle who everything went fine and are just out living their lives are not the ones necessarily putting the information out there. And so she's like, all I was seeing was either the best or the worst. And I just wanted to be like, show that it's somewhere in the middle. And I really appreciated that about her. And I think it's come up a couple of times of people kind of talking about, like you said, the internet is wonderful and terrible because it seems like there's maybe not as much just kind of middle of the road people that are doing what they need to do and outliving their lives.
Yeah, it's either I had IBD, but I can do 12 Ironman triathlons in a year, and then I climbed Everest. Or it's I have IBD, and how do I apply for disability because I can't work because I'm so sick because I had a surgery every month this year. And you're right. You don't see the people who are like, yeah, I have a couple days where I wasn't sure if it was going to be a flare, but it turns out I just like ate too much Taco Bell. And then I was okay. And I went back to living my life. Like, that's not an interesting story. It's just life.
Yeah. It's like Jason and his small, medium, and large flares.
Oh, that's right. And also Taco Bell can make anyone feel like they're having gastric distress.
You forget that though, when so much of your life has revolved around being a Crohn's patient, you get a little diarrhea and it's like, oh no, what is it going to be? Yeah. I have to give myself pep talks. Like normal people get stomach aches.
Yes, same. I have to remind myself that not every little sensation in my body is something going wrong.
It's funny because I think I've now spent enough time around y'all that like my stomach hurt a little bit. A couple of times lately, my stomach has hurt after eating. And I was like, oh my God, is it Crohn's disease? And I was like, Alicia, you are very old to be diagnosed with Crohn's disease at this point. So probably not Crohn's disease in your mid 40s, but I talk to people with IBD a lot. So apparently I've now decided I'm one of you, but without any of the symptoms except for an occasional stomach ache. Maybe it was.
It's a nice club.
You guys are all wonderful.
Only the best people are in this club.
Okay, Lauren, last question we ask everybody is if you had one piece of advice for the IBD community, what would it be?
I think along the lines of what we were just talking about in terms of like, you only see the very best or you only see the very worst stories. I think to use your voice, that all stories have value, that there are a lot of important conversations happening right now about healthcare, about access to care, about access to treatment and clinical trials and all of those things. And I think it's important to share the ups and downs, especially when you are having conversations among friends who maybe think differently or who haven't experienced our healthcare system in the way that you have or experienced life in the way that you have. I think as things feel increasingly polarized and divided, I think the only thing that really still helps bring people to a place of understanding is stories, individual stories. And so I think when you have the opportunity to share the way that day-to-day things work in your life that may be a little different. There are so many examples of things we've talked about tonight, from navigating prior authorizations for treatment or the cost of healthcare or getting a new job and having to think about the additional costs for health insurance if you've already met your out-of-pocket max, or thinking through a treatment decision. All of those little things that I think when you've been a patient of chronic illness for a long time become so ingrained of the fabric of your everyday life that you forget that it is kind of mind-blowing that it takes up so much space in your daily life. I think it's okay to share those things. And I think it's important to share those things as you're going through them, because it's the only way for other people to understand what it's like.
So true. And I think it is important. And I mean, we've already established that sharing stories with other people living with IBD is also super important because it helps to normalize this experience that they're going through as well. But sharing it with people who may not be as, aren't living in this type of world, I think it's really eye-opening to them and helps them become more empathetic to the situation and understanding, and helps bring them in as allies. Like you need these people to be saying, hey, health insurance, that's not cool. Or, hey, legislators, that's not a great policy as well. So it's not just you that's the one saying it. It's not just people living with chronic illnesses, because it then gives the impression that it's a small community instead of all of us that are dealing with this. So I think that's
And the
super
good
important.
stories too. One of the reasons I felt comfortable being on Remicade was because Megan Starshak talked about being on Remicade, and I knew that she felt great and was living a really active and healthy life. And anecdotal evidence is really powerful.
Yeah.
And so I talked to people a lot. I had to change my medication from the biologic Remicade to a biosimilar because my insurance company forced the change. And I was really nervous about it because I had been very stable for a long time. I would have not chosen to change, but there also wasn't a really good medical case to fight it. There was a lot of evidence that it would work just as well. And so I took the leap and trusted my doctor, and it's been fine. I've stayed stable throughout. And so I make sure to tell people that when they're nervous about making the switch, like, yeah, I get it. It's super scary. I was scared too. This was my experience because, as we were saying, the internet can be wonderful and terrible. You're not going to go write a blog post or post in a Facebook group or have a rant because you switched from a biologic to a biosimilar and everything went fine.
Right.
You're only going to post about it if it was absolutely amazing or, more likely, absolutely terrible. So then when somebody's nervous about the switch and they pull out Google and do a little search, all they're going to find are horror stories.
Yep.
And so the more we talk about the mundane everyday stuff.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many patients I've told, put your hands up and step away from Google. Like, you need to not go down these rabbit holes in these community forums and stuff, because the people who are fine, people who are just fine, are out living their lives and not documenting everything on the internet.
Well, and in the case of the biosimilar, like, nobody's having a world-class amazing experience. They're just having the same experience that they had before. And so it's not necessarily noteworthy because it's the same. It's only the only noteworthy experience is when it doesn't work for you, quote unquote, like you thought. And then you go and you rant and say, I can't believe this happened to me. So chances are you're not going to find any of the like good stuff because it's just another day. It's like, oh, okay, well, it worked. Cool. Yay. Move on, because you're good. You're fine. You're like outliving your life. You're, having fun with your kids. You're going to school. You're not sitting around being like, I should definitely tell people about this.
I should definitely tell people that I was totally freaked out. And in the end, it was just another day.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, well, it's why we only put like the good pictures on Facebook, right? And Instagram, like nobody's putting the pictures where you're like, look, I have a double chin, like that's the reality. But like, I'm not going to put that one. I'm going to be like, look at how chiseled my chin looks in this picture, using that one, like
look at this awesome angle.
Anyway, Lauren, we adore you and could talk to you forever and ever and ever and ever, and just continue to probably rant about the healthcare system.
True.
But
these are facts.
It is time to say goodbye. So Lauren, thank you so very much for joining us and for sharing your story with us. Thank you everyone else for joining us as well. So cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Hey, it's Lauren. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, subscribe, and share it with a friend.